The gavel's sharp crack felt like a guillotine dropping. Fiona sat silently in a frayed trench coat while her ex-husband smirked, adjusting a solid gold Patek Philippe. He was minutes away from legally destroying her, publicly mocking her poverty. He had absolutely no idea the probate documents had just cleared. Courtroom 302 of the Manhattan Supreme Court was suffocatingly quiet, save for the rhythmic, arrogant tapping of Ivan Sterling's Italian leather Oxfords against the witness stand. The polished mahogany of the room seemed to absorb the tension, but the hostility radiating from the plaintiff's table was palpable. Fiona sat beside her attorney, her posture rigidly straight. She wore a simple, unstructured navy blazer and a beige wool turtleneck that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, unpretentious clasp. To the casual observer, she looked exactly like what Ivan was painting her to be, a defeated, impoverished woman, desperately trying to cling to the coattails of her wealthy ex-husband. Mr. Sterling, Ivan's attorney, a notoriously ruthless litigator named Gregory Davies, paced in front of the stand. He adjusted his silk tie, his voice dripping with theatrical sympathy. "Could you describe the financial dynamics of your marriage to the defendant?" Ivan leaned into the microphone. He was handsome in that sharp, predatory way, jawline perfectly sculpted, silver-streaked hair meticulously styled, wearing a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit that cost more than most people's cars. "It was a parasitic relationship, frankly," Ivan said, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. He didn't even look at Fiona. His eyes were fixed on the Honorable Judge Sarah Jenkins, playing the victim with practiced ease. "From the day we met at that charity gala in Boston, I provided everything. I paid for the roof over her head, the clothes on her back, the food she ate. Fiona came into the marriage with nothing but a humanities degree and a maxed-out credit card." Fiona didn't flinch. She simply stared at her hands, resting on the defense table. Beside her, her attorney, Thomas Linwood, an older, seemingly weary man in a rumpled brown suit, scribbled something quietly on a yellow legal pad. He didn't object. He hadn't objected once all morning. "And during the 5 years of your marriage," Davies continued, turning to face the gallery, which was dotted with Ivan's affluent friends and a few bored reporters, "did the defendant make any meaningful financial contributions to the household?" "None," Ivan scoffed, a genuine laugh escaping his lips. "She insisted on working part-time at a local library, said she wanted to give back to the community. Meanwhile, I was running Sterling Logistics, pulling 80-hour weeks to maintain our lifestyle. When we decided to divorce, she suddenly felt entitled to half of my company, a company my grandfather built." Ivan was currently suing Fiona to completely invalidate their post-nuptial agreement. After he had been caught in a glaringly public affair with an heiress named Chloe Bingham, Fiona had filed for divorce. To punish her, Ivan had initiated a scorched-earth legal campaign. He wasn't just trying to protect his assets, he was trying to stick Fiona with the massive hidden debts he had accrued to keep his failing logistics empire afloat, claiming she was a silent partner in his reckless investments. He wanted to leave her destitute, carrying his millions in debt. "Is it true, Mr. Sterling," Davies asked, lowering his voice for dramatic effect, "that you offered Fiona a generous settlement of $100,000 to walk away cleanly, and she refused out of sheer greed?" "I did," Ivan said, finally turning his piercing gaze toward Fiona. The disdain in his eyes was raw and venomous. "I tried to be generous. I knew she had nothing to fall back on. Her family is, well, let's just say she doesn't have a safety net. But she wanted to bleed me dry. It's the classic tale of a gold digger who miscalculated." A low murmur rippled through the gallery. Judge Jenkins banged her gavel lightly. "Order," Mr. Davies, let's keep the testimony to the facts of the asset division. Of course, Your Honor. Davies smiled slickly. No further questions for my client at this time. Thomas Linwood slowly stood up from Fiona's side. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked at Ivan. No cross-examination at this time, Your Honor. We will address these claims when we present our evidence. Ivan smirked, stepping down from the stand. As he walked past Fiona's table to return to his seat, he leaned in slightly, his voice a harsh whisper meant only for her. Enjoy the library, Fiona, because after today, you won't even be able to afford a late fee. Fiona took a slow, deep breath. For 5 years, she had endured Ivan's condescension. When they met, she had intentionally hidden her background. Her father had always warned her about the isolating, corrupting nature of extreme wealth. Let them love you for your mind, Fiona, he used to say. The money is just a loud noise. It drowns out who people really are. She had lived modestly, driven a 10-year-old sedan, and let Ivan believe he was the absolute center of her financial universe. She had loved him, genuinely, hoping his ambition would soften into partnership. Instead, his wealth had become a weapon. And now, he was using it to try and bury her. The afternoon session began with Fiona taking the stand. As she walked up, the contrast between her and her ex-husband couldn't have been starker. She looked small, vulnerable, but her eyes were startlingly calm. Gregory Davies approached the podium like a shark circling a wounded seal. He had spent the morning painting Ivan as a hard-working martyr. Now, it was time to destroy Fiona's credibility completely. Ms. Harrison, Davies began, intentionally using her maiden name. Let's talk about your background. Your ex-husband testified that you came into this marriage with virtually zero assets. Is that correct? I had a modest savings account, Fiona replied, her voice steady and clear. Modest, Davies chuckled, looking at his notes. According to these bank records from 2019, your checking account held exactly $2,400. Meanwhile, you were moving into my client's $6 million penthouse in Tribeca. Quite the upgrade. I moved in because we were married, Fiona said simply. Let's talk about your family, Miss Harrison. Your father, Arthur Harrison, Arthur Pendleton, recently passed away, did he not? For a fraction of a second, Fiona's composure cracked. The grief was still a raw, open wound. Her father had died of sudden cardiac arrest just 4 weeks ago. The pain of losing her only living family member was the only reason she had remained so passive during the initial stages of Ivan's legal assault. Yes, she whispered. He died last month. My condolences, Davies said, in a tone that suggested anything but. Now your father lived in a secluded cabin in the woods of upstate New York, correct? Off the grid, as they say. He valued his privacy, Fiona answered. Right. Privacy. And he worked as a mechanic for most of his life? He worked with machinery, yes. Davies turned to the judge, spreading his hands. Your Honor, I bring this up to establish a pattern of financial desperation. Ms. Harrison comes from a background of profound financial instability. Her father lived in a literal shack. When he passed, I assume you inherited his estate, Ms. Harrison? Ivan let out an audible scoff from the plaintiff's table. I inherited everything he had, Fiona said, her voice dropping a register, hardening into something cold. And has that inheritance allowed you to pay off the $2 million in joint marital debt you are legally responsible for? Davies pressed, his voice rising to a shout. Or are you sitting in this courtroom today, hoping the judge will force my client to pay off your share, simply because you are too poor to afford the consequences of the lifestyle you enjoyed on his dime? Objection, Linwood said mildly from his seat, not even bothering to stand. Badgering. Sustained, Judge Jenkins sighed. Tone it down, Mr. Davies. Miss Harrison. Davies leaned heavily on the podium, locking eyes with her. You are broke. You have always been broke. You saw Ivan Sterling as a lottery ticket, and when the marriage failed, you refused to let go of the winning numbers. Isn't that the absolute truth? Fiona looked past Davies, locking eyes with Ivan. Ivan was smiling, a cruel, triumphant smirk. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully cornered the mouse. No, Mr. Davies, Fiona said softly, but the acoustics of the room carried her voice perfectly. That is not the truth. I never needed Ivan's money. I only ever wanted his honesty. Davies threw his hands up in mock exasperation. No further questions for this witness, Your Honor. The defense rests its delusions. As Davies walked back to his seat, high-fiving Ivan under the table, Judge Jenkins looked over at Thomas Linwood. Mr. Linwood, do you have any redirect for your client? Linwood finally stood up. He buttoned his rumpled suit jacket, picked up a thick, leather-bound folder from his desk, and walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom. The weary, passive demeanor he had carried all day seemed to evaporate with every step. I do, Your Honor, Linwood said, his voice suddenly sharp, authoritative, and commanding. He didn't sound like a cheap divorce lawyer anymore. He sounded like a corporate executioner. Ms. Harrison, Linwood began, standing just a few feet from her. Mr. Davies spent a great deal of time discussing your late father, Arthur Pendleton. He referred to him as a mechanic who lived in a shack. He did, Fiona nodded. Could you please clarify for the court exactly what kind of machinery your father worked with? Fiona took a breath. The charade was over. Her father was gone, and there was no longer any need to protect the secret of their quiet life. My father designed propulsion systems, Fiona said, specifically for commercial and military aviation. Ivan frowned, leaning forward in his chair. Davies looked up from his notes, a confused wrinkle forming on his forehead. And did he work for a specific company, Fiona? Linwood asked. He didn't work for a company, Thomas, Fiona said, addressing her lawyer by his first name. He owned it. He was the founder and majority shareholder of Pendleton Aerospace. A dead silence fell over courtroom 302. Ivan's face went completely slack. Pendleton Aerospace wasn't just a company. It was a global titan, a shadow corporation that manufactured components for nearly every major airline and defense contractor in the Western Hemisphere. Objection, Davies practically shouted, jumping to his feet. Relevance and hearsay. This is a desperate fabrication to save face. It is neither, Your Honor, Linwood stated smoothly, turning to the judge and opening the heavy leather folder. I have here the finalized court-certified probate documents from the state of Delaware, unsealed as of 9 a.m. this morning. Linwood handed a thick stack of watermarked documents to the bailiff, who walked them up to the judge's bench. He then walked over and dropped a duplicate stack directly in front of Ivan and his attorney. The loud thud of the paper hitting the mahogany table made Ivan flinch. As the primary executor of the Pendleton estate, Linwood continued, his voice ringing with absolute authority. I can confirm that Arthur Pendleton's net worth at the time of his passing was approximately $1.2 trillion, held in various trusts, liquid assets, and controlling shares. And as of this morning, Fiona Harrison is the sole, uncontested beneficiary of the Pendleton Hayes Trust. Linwood turned slowly on his heel, looking directly at Ivan, whose face had drained of all color, matching the white dress shirt beneath his expensive suit. My client isn't a gold digger, Mr. Sterling, Linwood said softly. She could buy your entire logistics company with the interest her checking account generated during our lunch break. For a full 60 seconds, the only sound in courtroom 302 was the frantic, desperate rustling of heavy paper. Gregory Davies, the shark-like attorney who had been strutting across the floor mere minutes ago, was now violently flipping through the probate documents, his manicured fingers trembling. Beside him, Ivan Sterling stared blankly at the first page, his eyes fixed on the string of zeros attached to the total estate valuation. He blinked rapidly, as if expecting the numbers to rearrange themselves into something that made sense. This is a forgery, Ivan finally choked out, his voice entirely stripped of its former baritone resonance. He looked up at the judge, his face a mask of panicked disbelief. Your Honor, this is an absurd stunt. Her father lived in a shed. He drove a rusted Ford. He was a mechanic. Arthur Pendleton was a mechanical engineer, Mr. Sterling, Thomas Linwood corrected, leaning casually against the defense table. He didn't look tired anymore. He looked like a man who had spent months meticulously building a trap and was finally watching the steel jaws snap shut. And he lived in a heavily fortified, carbon-neutral compound because he held Level 5 security clearances with the Department of Defense. But please, continue telling the court how much you know about my client's family. Judge Sarah Jenkins pushed her reading glasses down the bridge of her nose, examining the certified seals on the documents before her. She looked from the paperwork to Fiona, then down to Ivan. Mr. Davies, Judge Jenkins said, her voice dry and devoid of sympathy. These documents are authenticated by the Delaware Chancery Court, complete with federal tax identification numbers and the signatures of 3 separate federal adjudicators. Unless you have a forensic team outside ready to prove the entire United States probate system has been compromised, these are factual documents. Davies swallowed hard. The aggressive bluster had completely drained from his face, but a defense attorney of his caliber rarely stayed down for long. The panic in his eyes suddenly morphed into a calculating, greedy glint. Your Honor, Davies said, straightening his tie and attempting to recover his composure. If this is true, if Miss Harrison has indeed come into this astronomical wealth, then it fundamentally changes the nature of this divorce. Ivan looked at his lawyer, confused at first, before the realization dawned on him. A sick, desperate smile crept back onto his face. Exactly, Ivan said eagerly, standing up. We are still legally married. If she has inherited $1 trillion estate, then those assets were acquired during the marriage. She hid them from me. I am entitled to half. The audacity of the claim caused a collective gasp from the gallery. Just an hour ago, Ivan had sworn under oath that Fiona was a parasite, and he wanted her left with nothing. Now, he was drooling at the prospect of taking half of her father's empire. Linwood let out a slow, booming laugh that echoed off the mahogany walls. Mr. Davies, did you even read page 4 of the trust, or were you too blinded by the zeros? Linwood asked, gesturing to the stack of papers. Arthur Pendleton was a genius in aerospace, but he was also a genius in asset protection. The Pendleton Hayes Trust is a generation-skipping dynasty trust structured in South Dakota. Linwood stepped back toward the center of the room, raising a hand to tick off the devastating facts on his fingers. First, the trust explicitly excludes any spouses, current or former, from accessing the principal or the interest. It is constitutionally impenetrable. Second, Fiona didn't inherit the money until 9 a.m. this morning, exactly 3 hours after you and your client formally stated on the court record that you wanted the post-nuptial agreement invalidated to ensure strict separation of non-marital assets. Third, and most importantly, the assets aren't cash, Mr. Sterling. They are holding companies, which brings us to the crux of why we are actually here today. Linwood turned to Judge Jenkins. Your Honor, Mr. Sterling initiated this lawsuit to force my client to absorb $2 million of hidden debt associated with his company, Sterling Logistics. He claimed this debt was marital. That is correct, Mr. Linwood, Judge Jenkins said, leaning forward, utterly captivated. What Mr. Sterling failed to disclose, Linwood continued, pulling a final sheet of paper from his folder, was who owned that debt. Sterling Logistics has been kept afloat for the last 3 years by a massive, high-interest line of credit from a venture capital firm called Apex Holdings. Ivan's face drained of color again, this time turning a sickly shade of gray. He knew Apex Holdings. They were his lifeline. Without them, Sterling Logistics would have folded years ago. And who owns Apex Holdings, Mr. Linwood? Judge Jenkins asked, already knowing the answer. Apex Holdings is a wholly owned subsidiary of Pendleton Aerospace. Linwood smiled, turning to look dead into Ivan's eyes. Which means, as of 9 a.m. this morning, Ivan Sterling owes his entire fraudulent, failing empire directly to my client. The silence that followed Thomas Linwood's defionation was not merely heavy. It was a physical weight, pressing down on the polished mahogany of courtroom 302 until the air felt too thick to breathe. It was the sound of a carefully constructed, glittering empire instantly evaporating into vapor. Ivan Sterling swayed on his feet, his knuckles turning a bloodless, skeletal white as he gripped the edge of the plaintiff's table to keep from collapsing. The solid gold Patek Philippe on his wrist, which had caught the fluorescent lights so triumphantly all morning, suddenly looked less like a status symbol and more like a gilded shackle. His chest heaved with shallow, frantic breaths. He stared at the watermarked Delaware probate documents as if they were written in a dead language, desperately trying to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the trap he had blindly walked into. Gregory Davies, the notoriously aggressive litigator who had spent the entire day acting like a circling shark, abruptly stopped moving. The predatory gleam in his eyes vanished, replaced by the stark, terrifying realization of a man who suddenly realizes he is bleeding in shark-infested waters. Apex Holdings, Ivan rasped, the words tearing at his throat. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot and wide with an animalistic panic. That's impossible. Apex is a shadow firm out of Chicago. They saved my company. They underwrote the fleet expansion. You can't own Apex. Arthur Pendleton owned Apex, Mr. Sterling, Linwood corrected, his voice a smooth, icy contrast to Ivan's unraveling sanity. He acquired the debt exactly 3 years ago, operating through a series of blind trusts, which means, as the sole beneficiary and current executor of the Pendleton Hayes Trust, Fiona Harrison owns every single promissory note, every lien, and every piece of collateral attached to Sterling Logistics. Davies didn't even look at his client. The attorney immediately began throwing his Mont Blanc pens and legal pads into his expensive Italian leather briefcase with frantic, uncoordinated movements. Your Honor, Davies said, his voice cracking slightly, aggressively distancing himself from the blast zone. I would like it placed on the official record that I was entirely unaware of the plaintiff's true financial insolvency, or his attempts to fraudulently misrepresent his corporate liabilities to this court. My firm relied on the affidavits provided by Mr. Sterling. You coward, Ivan hissed, turning on his lawyer. You told me we had her pinned. You told me she was a nobody. I told you to settle for the 100,000, Ivan, Davies shot back, snapping his briefcase shut. You wanted to ruin her. Well, congratulations. You found the one person on earth who could buy and sell you before breakfast, and you handed her the matches." Fiona finally stood. The modest, unstructured navy blazer and the frayed beige turtleneck she wore no longer made her look small, vulnerable, or impoverished. Bathed in the aftermath of the revelation, they made her look utterly untouchable. She didn't need bespoke suits or imported leather to project power. She now owned the very boardrooms where those labels were manufactured, traded, and financed. She walked out from behind the defense table, taking slow, deliberate steps toward the center aisle. She didn't look at the stunned gallery, the scrambling attorney, or the captivated judge. She locked eyes solely with the man who had spent the last 5 years actively trying to make her feel worthless. "You planned this," Ivan stammered, backing away slightly, his voice dropping into a desperate, pathetic whine. "You and that crazy old man. You set me up from the beginning. We were married, Fiona. 5 years. You lied to me every single day." "I never lied about who I was, Ivan," Fiona said, her voice echoing with a chilling, calm authority that commanded the absolute attention of the room. "I told you I valued hard work, integrity, and quiet living. I fell in love with a man I thought was brilliant and driven. But my father saw straight through you the very first night you came to dinner." Fiona paused, letting the memory hang in the air. "Do you remember what you did that night?" she asked softly. "You mocked his old Ford truck. You made a sarcastic comment about the drafty windows in his cabin. You sat at his handmade wooden table and bragged about your profit margins, completely blind to the fact that the man pouring your coffee designed the propulsion systems for the private jets you chartered. He knew immediately that you were over-leveraged, arrogant, and recklessly greedy." Ivan couldn't maintain eye contact. He stared at the floor, a single bead of sweat rolling down his temple, ruining his immaculate grooming. "He didn't buy your debt to ruin you, Ivan," Fiona continued, her tone dropping into something almost pitying. "He bought your debt to protect me. He knew that one day your vanity would eclipse your sense. He knew you would eventually find a Chloe Bingham, someone with enough new money to make you feel important, and that when you did, you would try to destroy me to protect your fragile ego. He built a glass house around you, and you just threw the biggest stone you could find." "Fiona, please," Yvonne begged, a tear of genuine terror finally slipping down his cheek. The arrogant titan of industry was completely gone. "If you call in those loans, it triggers a cascade default. It will bankrupt me. The board will liquidate the company. I'll lose everything. The warehouses, the trucks, the contracts." "I am aware of the financial mechanics," Fiona stated flatly. "As the managing director of Apex Holdings, I am officially calling in the loans. Sterling Logistics is in immediate, catastrophic default. You breached the strict moral hazard covenants of the loan agreement the second you attempted to offload this corporate liability onto me in a fraudulent divorce proceeding." Ivan dropped to his knees, his hands clasping the edge of the polished table as if praying to an absent god. "The penthouse, Fiona. I'll give you the Tribeca penthouse. Just don't liquidate the company." "I am already taking the penthouse, Ivan," Fiona replied coldly. "It was listed as primary collateral in the 2023 restructuring agreement you signed with Apex. Chloe might let you move into her guest house, though given she only dates men on the Forbes Top 400 list, I wouldn't bother packing your designer suits just yet." Thomas Linwood stepped forward, seamlessly taking control of the legal battlefield. He approached the bench, handing a final stack of formalized motions to the stunned bailiff. "Your Honor," Linwood said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "In light of these documented revelations, the defense requests the following immediate actions." Judge Sarah Jenkins didn't hesitate. She picked up her heavy steel pen, her face a mask of judicial fury directed entirely at the kneeling man. "I am prepared to rule," Judge Jenkins declared, her voice slicing through the courtroom. "Based on the undisputed financial documentation and the plaintiff's blatant perjury, I am ordering the following. Enforcement of the post-nuptial agreement. The original separation of assets remains entirely intact. Fiona Harrison retains full, unencumbered ownership of the Pendleton Hayes Trust. Dismissal with prejudice. All claims by the plaintiff regarding shared marital debt are dismissed immediately with extreme prejudice. Asset seizure. Authorization. The court acknowledges Apex Holdings' legal right to immediately begin seizing all collateral associated with Sterling Logistics' defaulted loans. Criminal referral. A full, unredacted transcript of this morning's proceedings will be forwarded directly to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. Judge Jenkins leaned over her bench, glaring down at Ivan. Attempted financial fraud against this court, combined with systemic perjury, carries significant mandatory prison sentences in the state of New York. Mr. Sterling, I suggest you retain a very competent criminal defense attorney, and I highly suggest you pay them in cash while you still have some. Bang! The heavy wooden gavel fell for the final time, sounding like the slamming of a vault door. Ivan's arms gave out completely. He collapsed onto the floor of the courtroom, a trembling, ruined heap of bespoke charcoal wool and shattered arrogance, sobbing openly as his entire existence was legally erased. Fiona did not gloat. She did not cheer, nor did she offer him a final, triumphant smirk. She simply buttoned her fraying trench coat, picked up her sensible, worn leather handbag, and walked down the center aisle. She pushed through the heavy mahogany doors, leaving him to the ruins he had built with his own 2 hands, and stepped out into the crisp, clean air of a world that now belonged entirely to her. Fiona walked out of the courthouse, leaving Ivan bankrupt and broken in the gallery. The autumn air felt crisp, entirely free of the toxic weight she had carried for years. She hadn't just survived his cruelty. She had systematically dismantled his empire. Stepping into the waiting town car, she finally smiled. Her father was right. Money was just noise, but today it was a beautiful symphony.